We are moving on from the first word of the Bible and now find ourselves with another controversy, the second word of the Bible. I discussed this briefly in a previous video. However, I wanted to provide an idea of what the Big Bang would look like in terms of ex materia creation before going into more detail about the Hebrew word bara. When you look at Hebrew lexicons, the verb bara is defined as shaping, forming, fashioning, and creating. The root word etymology points to the idea of cutting, splitting, dividing, and separating. In the King James Version of the Bible, this verb appears 54 times. 42 of those are translated to the English verb to create. For the most part, God is the only one who uses the passive form of the verb. An exception would be in Ezekiel. Now, while humans must work with their hands or with tools in order to construct something, God is not constricted in this way. Therefore, it is appropriate to use a different form of the verb. Again, there's a passive form of the verb and an intensive form of the verb. I used the sandcastle in video 2 in order to illustrate creation out of previously existing materials. However, for my family and I, this process was work intensive. We had to carry water in buckets, use tools to dig, we had to actively shape and form the structure with our hands. God, however, is capable of doing this without hands. Open your Bible to Joshua to see an interesting use of the verb bara. Here it is used to cut down the trees. They were to cut them down so that they could settle in the area. Of course, the wood is useful for building, crafting, and selling, but that's where they were going to dwell. Cutting trees is work intensive, and the form of the verb bara used here reflects that idea. What do we do when we cut, split, or divide something? We measure it, then we limit its size and shape by cutting. The dimensions of the raw materials change. We can form or shape something. By doing so, we can create something useful and functional. I would like to point out that neither the building nor the chair existed before we built them. They were something else. They were trees. They were raw materials. We mortals have to use our hands and our tools in order to do this. But God, through His power, has other means by which He can divide and limit the materials that He is working with. That is why the usage of bara is placed in a separate category when God does it. But the relationship and the root is obvious. Ezekiel has an interesting use of the passive form of the verb bara. Remember, this is the same form of the verb that God uses in creation. In this passage, it refers to making a sign of some kind. In many versions, the translation describes this making of a signpost. But in the King James, it just says to choose. Some of the commentaries talk about appointing a way, or marking out a place, marking out a way, a direction that these people should go. It's interesting that the author chose to use the passive form of the verb in this passage. The road is going along, and then it divides into two routes. The man was to draw a path on the map and create a signpost as to mark it. Literally, create a hand. So it is translated by Fairbairn, make a finger post at the head of the two ways, the hand post pointing Nebuchadnezzar to the way to Jerusalem. 2 chapters later, the intensive form of the verb is used. In this case, it is used in a violent way, to cut down enemies. That is a physical, intensive action. Allow me to demonstrate the intensive form of the verb bara. Here is a log, and I plan to change the size and shape of it. I will limit the dimensions of this raw material, specifically the length. I'm a little embarrassed at how long this actually took me. Now, consider God accomplishing the same task. You can see why it is better understood when God does it as dividing, separating, limiting the size, changing the dimensions, as opposed to actual physical cutting like I did in this demonstration. It's a different kind of action. I'd like to summarize what we discussed so far in this presentation. Both the passive and intensive form of the verb imply the idea of changing size, shape, or form. For the most part, God is the only one who uses the passive and physically effortless form of the verb create. This makes sense because for God, this is a power of change through the mind and spirit. The exception is Ezekiel 21:19 because the creator of the marking, using a sign or a hand pointing the way, was performing more of a mental task and strategy by pointing the direction as a guide. There are some other uses of the verb Bara in the Bible that are worth mentioning. In 1 Samuel 2:29, it is used in the sense of make yourselves fat. This still includes the idea of changing in size or shape. It is also used in the establishment of Israel from the human family and individual members formed within it. The establishment and creation of Israel is interesting because God sets them apart from the other nations. He's separating them from the other groups of people. We also have some transformations, restorations, and renovations. It's important to note that none of these uses imply ex nihilo creation.